Hello, and welcome back. We're so glad to have you with us. Tonight's story is about Jethro, the forgotten priest who changed Moses forever. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means so much and helps us continue bringing these biblical stories to life. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
What if one of the most influential figures in the story of Moses wasn't an Israelite at all? Long before the 10 Commandments were given, before Israel became a nation with laws and judges, a desert priest quietly shaped the future of God's people in a way few ever notice. His name was Jethro. Most people remember him simply as Moses' father-in-law, a minor character who briefly appears and then disappears from the biblical narrative. But is that all he was? The scriptures reveal far more than many realize. While history, archaeology, and centuries of Jewish and Christian scholarship raise fascinating questions about his identity, his faith, and his remarkable wisdom, was Jethro already a worshiper of the true God? Or did he come to believe after hearing of Israel's miraculous deliverance? Why did Moses trust his counsel so completely? And how did one conversation in the wilderness permanently transform the leadership of an entire nation? In this documentary, we'll trace Jethro's story from the deserts of Midian to the foot of Mount Sinai, separating biblical text from historical evidence, exploring scholarly debates, and uncovering why this often overlooked man may have left one of the greatest legacies in the entire Old Testament. By the end, you may never read the story of Moses the same way again. Before Moses ever crossed the wilderness into Midian, before the burning bush, before the plagues of Egypt, and before the Israelites began their journey toward freedom, there was already a man quietly leading his people in one of the harshest landscapes of the ancient Near East. His name was Jethro, although most readers remember him simply as Moses' father-in-law. The biblical text introduces him first by a very different title, the priest of Midian. That description is remarkably brief, yet it immediately distinguishes him from nearly every supporting character in the Exodus narrative. Unlike the Israelites suffering under Egyptian oppression, or the officials serving in Pharaoh's court, Jethro belonged to a separate people with their own history, customs, and traditions. He entered Israel's story not as a member of the covenant nation, but as a respected leader from outside it. Understanding who Jethro was requires stepping back long before his first appearance in Exodus and exploring the world that shaped him. According to Genesis 25, Midian was one of the sons born to Abraham through Keturah after Sarah's death. This genealogy places the Midianites within Abraham's extended family, while also explaining why they remain distinct from the descendants of Isaac and Jacob. They shared a common ancestor with Israel, but followed a different historical path. The covenant, promise that defined Israel's identity, were entrusted through Isaac. Yet, Abraham's other descendants established communities throughout the regions east and south of Canaan. This means Jethro was neither a complete outsider nor an Israelite. He belonged to a people connected to the biblical story through ancestry, but separated by geography, culture, and national identity. That relationship would later make his interactions with Moses especially significant, because they represented a meeting between two branches of Abraham's family, whose histories had unfolded in very different ways. The land of Midian itself was unlike the fertile Nile Valley that dominated Egypt, stretching across territories east of the Gulf of Aqaba into parts of northwestern Arabia. It was a region of rocky mountains, deep wadis, scattered oases, and wide expanses of desert. Life there demanded endurance rather than luxury. Communities depended on livestock, seasonal grazing, reliable wells, and trade routes that connected Arabia, Canaan, and Egypt. Archaeological research suggests that this broader region participated in commercial networks involving copper, incense, spices, textiles, and livestock, making Midian more connected to the ancient world than its barren appearance might suggest. Travelers, merchants, and nomadic tribes frequently crossed these routes, carrying not only goods, but also ideas, languages, and cultural traditions. Growing up in such an environment would have required practical wisdom, adaptability, and strong leadership, qualities that become increasingly evident in Jethro's later actions. Exodus introduces Jethro as the priest of Midian, but this title should not be understood through the lens of Israel's later priesthood established after Mount Sinai. At the point where Jethro first appears in the biblical timeline, there was no tabernacle, no Levitical priesthood, and no sacrificial system governed by the Mosaic law. In the tribal societies of the ancient Near East, a priest often fulfilled several responsibilities simultaneously. He conducted religious ceremonies, preserved ancestral traditions, advised community leaders, mediated disputes, supervised important rituals, and frequently served as one of the most respected elders within the tribe. Religious authority and civic leadership were closely connected, especially among pastoral societies where maintaining unity was essential for survival. Jethro's title, therefore, suggests far more than ceremonial duties. It indicates that he occupied a position of trust, experience, and influence within Midianite society long before Moses entered his household. One of the most discussed questions surrounding Jethro concerns his relationship with the God of Israel before the Exodus. The biblical text itself remains remarkably restrained. It identifies him as a priest, but does not explicitly describe the full nature of his worship prior to meeting Moses. This silence has led to several scholarly interpretations over the centuries. Some scholars argue that Jethro initially practiced the traditional religion of the Midianites, and only later acknowledged the supremacy of the God of Israel after hearing about the Exodus. Others have proposed what is commonly known as the Midianite or Canaanite hypothesis, suggesting that traditions associated with the worship of Yahweh may have existed among certain southern tribes before Israel reached Mount Sinai. This theory draws upon poetic passages such as Deuteronomy 33 and Judges 5, where God's appearance is associated with regions south of Canaan, including Seir and Paran. While the hypothesis remains an important topic within biblical scholarship, it is far from universally accepted, and the biblical narrative never directly states that Moses learned the worship of Yahweh from Jethro or the Midianites. Distinguishing between the scriptural account and later academic interpretation is essential, because the Bible deliberately leaves aspects of Jethro's earlier religious life unexplained. Another fascinating feature of Jethro's identity involves his various names throughout Scripture. In Exodus 2, Moses' future father-in-law is called Reuel, while later chapters consistently refer to him as Jethro. Elsewhere, the name Hobab appears in connection with Moses' extended family, creating one of the Old Testament's long-standing interpretive questions. Scholars have offered several explanations. Some believe Reuel was Jethro's personal name, while Jethro functioned as an honorific title, meaning something akin to his excellence or his abundance. Others suggest Reuel was the patriarch of the family, and Jethro his son, making Moses' father-in-law part of a larger household headed by an older generation. A third view argues that ancient naming practices simply allowed prominent individuals to be known by multiple names depending on context, family relationships, or social position. Ancient Near Eastern records provide numerous examples of individuals carrying more than one name or title. So, the existence of multiple names is not unusual within its historical setting. Although certainty remains elusive, the variation does not diminish the narrative's consistency. In every account, the same respected Midianite leader emerges as Moses' trusted elder and advisor. Beyond questions of genealogy and names, the biblical narrative quietly reveals Jethro's character even before he speaks a single recorded sentence. He led a household large enough to sustain multiple flocks, raised daughters accustomed to demanding daily responsibilities, and maintained a reputation that reflected stability rather than conflict. Leadership in tribal societies could not be sustained through force alone. It depended upon wisdom, fairness, and the confidence of the community. A priest who lacked judgment would quickly lose influence among people whose survival depended on cooperation during harsh seasons and scarce resources. By the time Moses eventually encountered him, Jethro had likely spent decades resolving disputes, preserving traditions, organizing family affairs, and guiding his people through the ordinary challenges of desert life. These experiences would later explain why his advice concerning leadership carried such practical insight. Unlike Pharaoh, whose authority rested upon political power and military strength, Jethro's influence appears rooted in respect earned over time. The contrast between these two leaders begins long before they ever intersect through Moses' story. One ruled the greatest empire of the age through centralized authority and coercion. The other governed a tribal community through experience, responsibility, and wisdom, shaped by the realities of the wilderness. The Bible does not exaggerate Jethro's importance, nor does it attempt to elevate him above the central figures of the Exodus. Instead, it presents him with remarkable restraint, allowing his actions to reveal his character gradually. That understated introduction may explain why so many readers overlook him. Yet, beneath the simplicity of the narrative, stands a man whose counsel would eventually reshape the administration of an entire nation. Before he became Moses' father-in-law, before he witnessed Israel's deliverance, and before he offered one of the most influential pieces of leadership advice recorded in Scripture. Jethro was already a respected priest, tribal elder, and patriarch whose life had been forged in the demanding world of Midian. As this story now shifts away from the deserts of Midian and toward the grandeur of Pharaoh's Egypt, another life is about to unfold. One that seems completely unrelated to Jethro's at first glance. Yet the decisions made inside the royal courts of Egypt will soon drive a young Hebrew into exile, setting him on the very path that leads to the household of the Midianite priest, whose quiet wisdom has already been preparing for a meeting that will alter the course of biblical history forever. While Jethro spent his life leading a quiet community in the rugged land of Midian, events unfolding hundreds of miles away in Egypt were preparing another man for a journey neither he nor anyone around him could foresee. Moses entered history during a period when the descendants of Jacob had grown from a single extended family into a large population living within Egypt. The book of Exodus explains that a new Pharaoh arose who no longer remembered Joseph, the Hebrew whose wisdom had once preserved Egypt from famine. Instead of viewing the Israelites as valuable residents, this new ruler saw their increasing numbers as a political danger. Fearing that they might one day join foreign enemies in a military conflict, Pharaoh subjected them to forced labor, compelling them to build storage cities and serve the ambitions of the Egyptian state. Yet, the more they were oppressed, the more they continued to multiply. According to the biblical account, Pharaoh responded by issuing one of the harshest commands recorded in the Old Testament, ordering that every newborn Hebrew boy should be killed. Against this backdrop of fear and violence, a child was born to Amram and Jochebed from the tribe of Levi. Unable to hide their son any longer, his mother placed him in a carefully prepared basket among the reeds of the Nile, entrusting his future to God's unseen providence. Pharaoh's daughter discovered the infant, recognized him as a Hebrew child, and chose compassion over policy by adopting him into the royal household. Through an extraordinary turn of events, Moses' own mother became his nurse during his earliest years before he was raised within the palace itself. From childhood, Moses lived between two worlds. By birth, he belonged to the enslaved Hebrews. By education and upbringing, he belonged to Egypt's ruling class. Scripture offers only a brief glimpse into those years, but later biblical testimony in Acts 7 states that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and became mighty in words and deeds. Ancient Egypt stood among the most advanced civilizations of its age, renowned for its monumental architecture, administrative systems, military organization, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. A young man raised within Pharaoh's household would likely have received instruction in reading and writing, governance, diplomacy, military strategy, religious customs, and the complex bureaucracy that sustained one of history's greatest kingdoms. Everything about Moses' early life suggested a future within Egypt's elite circles. Yet, beneath that privileged upbringing, remained a deeper identity that neither wealth nor education could erase. Exodus records that when Moses had grown older, he went out to observe the burdens carried by his own people. The text's wording is significant because it identifies the Hebrews not simply as slaves, but as his people. However, Moses came to know his origins, whether through his birth mother, his sister Miriam, or others within the royal household. He understood that the suffering he witnessed belonged to the nation from which he himself had come. During one of these visits, Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew laborer. Looking around and seeing no one nearby, he struck down the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The narrative neither celebrates nor excuses the act. Instead, it presents it with remarkable restraint, leaving readers to recognize both Moses' compassion for the oppressed and the tragic consequences of attempting to accomplish justice through his own strength. The following day revealed that the incident had not remained secret. When Moses encountered two Hebrews fighting one another, he intervened in an effort to stop the conflict. Rather than welcoming his authority, one of the men challenged him with a question that exposed the hidden crime. "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" In that single moment, Moses realized that his actions were known. His attempt to defend one Hebrew had not united his people behind him. Instead, it left him isolated from both the Egyptians and the Hebrews. The palace could no longer protect him. and the people he hoped to defend did not yet recognize him as their leader. Pharaoh soon learned what had happened and sought to execute Moses. Exodus describes the situation with only a few words, yet the implications were enormous. The man who had spent decades living as a prince suddenly became a condemned fugitive. Every privilege attached to his position vanished overnight. The education, influence, and security that had defined his life could no longer guarantee his survival. There would be no trial, no opportunity to explain his motives, and no possibility of restoring his former status. In the political world of ancient Egypt, an individual perceived as threatening royal authority could expect swift punishment, particularly if his actions appeared connected to sympathy for an enslaved population. Escape became Moses's only option. His destination was the land of Midian, beyond the direct reach of Egyptian power. The Bible gives almost no details about the journey itself, yet the silence invites reflection. Moses traveled away from the fertile Nile Valley into increasingly dry and unfamiliar landscapes, where royal roads gave way to desert paths and cultivated fields disappeared behind rocky hills and open wilderness. The physical distance reflected an equally profound personal transformation. Every step carried him farther from the identity that had shaped his entire life. He was no longer an adopted grandson of Pharaoh. He was not yet the deliverer of Israel. He possessed remarkable education, but no position through which to use it. He carried a passionate concern for justice, but had learned that zeal alone could not accomplish God's purposes. The wilderness became a place where every external source of confidence was stripped away. Significantly, the biblical narrative records no divine voice during this period of flight. God does not explain why these events have unfolded, nor does he reveal the future awaiting Moses. Readers know from the opening chapters of Exodus that God's providence has been guiding Moses since infancy. But Moses himself walks into uncertainty without seeing the larger picture. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout Scripture. God's preparation often begins long before his calling is fully revealed. Seasons that appear to be marked by failure, silence, or exile frequently become the foundation upon which future service is built. Moses likely believed that his opportunity to help his people had ended in disaster. From his perspective, he had lost everything that once defined him. Yet, from the perspective of the biblical narrative, Egypt had completed only the first stage of his education. The palace had taught him how empires governed, how rulers exercised authority, and how power shaped society. The next lessons could never be learned within marble halls or royal courts. They would come through years spent far from civilization, in a land where survival depended upon patience, humility, and endurance rather than status or influence. The contrast could hardly have been greater. One chapter of Moses' life closed beneath the towering monuments of Egypt. The next would begin in the quiet expanses of Midian, where an unexpected encounter with the household of a respected priest named Jethro would provide not only refuge from Pharaoh's wrath, but also the setting in which God would prepare his chosen servant over the course of 4 decades before calling him back to confront the greatest empire of his age. Moses arrived in Midian, carrying little more than the memories of a life that no longer existed. Egypt had been left behind, yet the future remained completely uncertain. Scripture gives no indication that he entered the region with a destination in mind, or that he already knew anything about the people who lived there. He was simply a fugitive, seeking safety beyond Pharaoh's reach. The turning point came beside a well, one of the most important gathering places in the ancient Near East. Wells were far more than sources of water. In regions where rainfall was scarce and permanent rivers were rare, they became the center of daily life. Shepherds brought their flocks there. Merchants rested during long caravan journeys. Travelers exchanged news, and local families performed the essential work of drawing water. Several decisive moments in the book of Genesis also take place beside wells, including the meetings of Abraham's servant with Rebekah and Jacob with Rachel. Exodus continues that familiar biblical pattern, not by repeating the earlier stories, but by using another ordinary setting through which God's providence quietly moves history forward. As Moses rested beside the well, 7 daughters of the priest of Midian arrived to draw water for their father's flock. The Bible identifies their father only by his position at first, the priest of Midian, introducing him through his public role before revealing his personal relationship with Moses. The presence of 7 daughters performing this demanding task reflects the responsibilities shared within pastoral households. Shepherding required constant labor, and every capable member of the family contributed to the survival of the community. Before the women could finish watering the animals, other shepherds arrived and drove them away. Exodus does not explain whether this was a recurring act of intimidation or simply a dispute over access to the well, but the result was clear. The daughters of the Midianite priest were prevented from completing their work. Moses responded immediately. Having recently fled Egypt after defending an abused Hebrew, he once again found himself witnessing injustice. This time, however, the outcome unfolded very differently. Instead of acting with uncontrolled violence, Moses confronted the shepherds, drove them away, and then remained to help the women draw enough water for the entire flock. The biblical account records no unnecessary conflict, no dramatic speeches, and no celebration of personal heroism. It simply presents a man who chose to protect those being mistreated and then willingly performed the difficult physical labor that followed. His actions revealed a humility rarely associated with someone who had once lived in Pharaoh's palace. The daughters returned home much earlier than expected, immediately attracting their father's attention. Surprised by their unusually quick return, he asked why they had finished so soon. Their answer is equally revealing. They described Moses as an Egyptian who had rescued them from the shepherds, drawn water on their behalf, and watered the flock himself. Their description reminds readers that although Moses was Hebrew by birth, decades inside the Egyptian royal court had shaped his appearance so thoroughly that strangers naturally identified him as an Egyptian. His clothing, language, education, and mannerisms all reflected the world in which he had been raised. Jethro's response was both practical and generous. Rather than merely expressing gratitude, he immediately asked why the stranger had been left behind and instructed his daughters to invite him into their home for a meal. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was far more than courtesy. In harsh desert environments, welcoming travelers and providing food, water, and shelter formed part of an essential moral obligation shared across many tribal cultures. A stranger arriving peacefully at one's household was often treated with honor, particularly after demonstrating kindness toward members of the family. Moses accepted the invitation and entered the household of the Midianite priest, unaware that what appeared to be a single evening of hospitality would become the beginning of an entirely new life. Exodus summarizes the next stage of the story with remarkable simplicity. Moses agreed to remain with Jethro, and in time Jethro gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Unlike many ancient marriage narratives that emphasize negotiations, wealth, or political alliances, the biblical account focuses instead on the formation of trust between two men. Jethro knew nothing of Moses' royal upbringing or the circumstances surrounding his exile beyond what could be observed directly. He did not know that this refugee had once been adopted into Pharaoh's household. He did not know that Moses would one day stand before the king of Egypt, demanding the freedom of Israel. What he saw was a man of courage, compassion, humility, and willingness to serve without expectation of reward. Those qualities proved sufficient to welcome Moses permanently into the family. Marriage to Zipporah transformed Moses from a wandering exile into a member of Jethro's household. Soon afterward, Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, explaining, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." The name reflects far more than geography. It captures Moses' emotional state during those early years in Midian. Egypt was no longer his home. Yet Midian had not originally been his homeland either. He belonged fully to neither world. His identity remained suspended between the nation of his birth and the nation in which he had been raised. Later, biblical passages mention a second son, Eliezer, whose name means, "My God is help," accompanied by Moses' acknowledgement that the God of his father had delivered him from Pharaoh's sword. Together, the names of his sons quietly trace Moses' spiritual journey. Gershom expresses the loneliness of exile. Eliezer expresses gratitude for divine preservation. Between those two names lies the gradual transformation of a man learning to trust God's providence during years when no extraordinary miracles appeared to be taking place. Moses spent the next 40 years living in Midian, tending Jethro's flocks across the wilderness. Scripture offers almost no details about those decades, yet their silence is deeply significant. The Bible often devotes many chapters to a single year, while summarizing decades in only a few sentences. This does not suggest those years lacked importance. On the contrary, they formed the longest uninterrupted period of Moses' life. During that time, he exchanged the routines of palace life for the rhythms of the wilderness. Instead of supervising servants, he cared for sheep. Instead of studying within Egypt's centers of learning, he observed changing seasons, rugged mountains, hidden valleys, and the difficult realities of desert survival. Every journey across Midian's landscape taught patience, endurance, careful observation, and dependence upon resources that could never be taken for granted. These lessons would later become indispensable when leading an entire nation through similar terrain. Jethro's influence during these decades should not be underestimated, even though the biblical text records very few conversations between the two men. As the head of the household, the priest of Midian would naturally have guided family affairs, supervised the flocks, resolved disputes, and passed practical knowledge from one generation to the next. Moses, despite his remarkable education in Egypt, now lived under the authority of an experienced tribal leader, whose wisdom had been shaped not by imperial politics, but by decades of governing a pastoral community, without drawing attention to it. The narrative places Moses in the position of learner once again. The man who had once received instruction in Pharaoh's palace now gained an entirely different education beneath the guidance of his father-in-law. These years also reveal something important about God's pattern of preparation. Nothing during this period appears outwardly dramatic. There are no plagues, no prophetic messages, no public victories, and no recorded miracles. To an outside observer, Moses may have seemed like a forgotten exile whose greatest opportunities had already passed. Yet, from the perspective of Scripture, these quiet decades were not an interruption of God's plan, but an essential part of it. Before Moses could shepherd the people of Israel, he first had to learn how to shepherd literal flocks. Before he could guide a nation across the wilderness, he had to know the wilderness itself. Before he could stand before Pharaoh with confidence grounded in obedience to God, he had to be emptied of the confidence that once came from royal privilege alone. For 40 years, the household of Jethro became both Moses' refuge and his classroom, preparing him in ways neither man could fully understand. The stillness of Midian would not last forever. One ordinary day, while leading Jethro's flock beyond the usual grazing lands toward the wilderness surrounding Horeb, Moses would witness an event unlike anything he had ever seen. An encounter that would bring his long season of preparation to an end and begin the mission for which every stage of his life had been quietly preparing him. After 40 years in Midian, Moses' daily routine had become remarkably ordinary. The dramatic events that once defined his life in Egypt seemed like distant memories, replaced by the steady rhythm of shepherding Jethro's flocks across the rugged wilderness. Day after day, he guided sheep through rocky valleys, searched for grazing land, and led the animals from one water source to another. It was a life shaped by patience rather than ambition, responsibility rather than recognition. From a human perspective, Moses' greatest opportunities appeared to be behind him. He was no longer a prince, no longer a political figure, and no longer a man whose future seemed capable of changing history. Yet, it was precisely within this ordinary routine that the biblical narrative introduces one of its most extraordinary moments. Exodus records that Moses was leading the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The description suggests that Moses had traveled beyond the more familiar grazing areas into a remote region where shepherds occasionally searched for seasonal pasture. Nothing in the account indicates that Moses expected anything unusual to happen that day. There were no signs that he had set out on a spiritual pilgrimage or was searching for divine revelation. His attention remained focused on the practical work that had occupied him for decades. Then he noticed something that immediately challenged every expectation formed by years of living in the wilderness. A bush was on fire, yet the flames failed to consume it. Fire was hardly uncommon in dry landscapes where heat and lightning could ignite vegetation. The miracle lay not in the presence of fire itself, but in its impossible behavior. The bush continued burning while remaining completely intact. Moses responded exactly as a careful observer would. Rather than walking away, he decided to investigate, saying to himself that he would turn aside and see this remarkable sight. Only after Moses deliberately changed his course does the narrative reveal that God called to him from the midst of the bush. The sequence is significant. Scripture does not portray Moses as someone passively overwhelmed by a miracle. It first presents him as a man willing to stop, observe, and draw closer when confronted with something that demanded explanation. The voice called his name twice, "Moses, Moses," and he answered, "Here I am." God immediately instructed him not to come any closer and to remove his sandals because the ground upon which he stood had become holy through God's presence. In the ancient Near East, removing one's sandals before entering a sacred place expressed reverence and acknowledgement that one stood before a reality far greater than oneself. The holiness belonged not to the mountain or the bush, but to the presence of God, who had chosen that location for his revelation. God then identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, directly connecting this encounter to the covenant established generations earlier. Moses responded by hiding his face because he was afraid to look upon God. The conversation that followed transformed the direction of Moses' life. God declared that he had seen the affliction of Israel in Egypt, heard their cries, and knew their suffering. These statements reveal an important theological truth. Israel's oppression had never escaped God's attention. The apparent silence of previous generations did not indicate divine indifference. God had been fully aware of every hardship, and the time had now come to act according to his covenant promises. Moses then received the commission that would define the remainder of his life. God commanded him to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh, leading the Israelites out of slavery. Moses' immediate response was not confidence, but hesitation. He questioned his own ability, asking, "Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" The question reflected more than humility. 40 years earlier, Moses had attempted to defend one Hebrew through his own strength and had failed completely. He had fled Egypt as a wanted man, rejected by both Pharaoh and the people he hoped to help. From his perspective, returning now seemed unimaginable. Throughout the remainder of Exodus chapter 3 and into chapter 4, Moses raised a series of objections. He asked what name he should give if the Israelites questioned who had sent him. God answered with the profound declaration, "I am who I am," revealing his covenant name in a way that would become foundational throughout Israel's history. Moses worried that the people would not believe him, prompting God to provide miraculous signs involving his staff, his hand, and water from the Nile. Moses then argued that he was not eloquent, describing himself as slow of speech and tongue. God reminded him that the Creator of human speech would be with him and teach him what to say. Finally, Moses pleaded for God to send someone else. At this point, the biblical text states that the Lord's anger burned against Moses. Yet even then, God graciously appointed Aaron to serve as his spokesman, while reaffirming that Moses himself remained the chosen leader. The burning bush narrative reveals a remarkable transformation in Moses' character. The man who once acted impulsively now hesitated repeatedly. His earlier confidence had been replaced by deep awareness of his own limitations. While some readers view these objections negatively, they also demonstrate that 40 years in Midian had profoundly changed him. The self-assured prince who believed he could rescue Israel through decisive action no longer existed. In his place stood a shepherd who understood how inadequate human strength alone could be when facing impossible circumstances. Before leaving Horeb, Moses took the staff that had accompanied his years of shepherding, a simple tool that God declared would become the instrument through which miraculous signs would later be performed. The ordinary staff of a shepherd would soon become one of the most recognizable symbols in the Exodus story, illustrating how God often transforms familiar objects into instruments for extraordinary purposes. After receiving God's commission, Moses returned to the household that had been his home for 4 decades. Here, the narrative introduces one of the most understated yet revealing moments in Jethro's story. Exodus 4:18 records that Moses went back to Jethro and said, "Let me return to my own people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive." Readers who know the full conversation at the burning bush may notice that Moses did not repeat every detail of his divine encounter. Scripture does not explain why. Perhaps he wished to speak cautiously until the mission unfolded. Perhaps the narrative simply chooses not to record the entire conversation. Whatever the reason, one detail stands out unmistakably. Moses asked for Jethro's permission before leaving. This request reveals both cultural custom and personal character. In the tribal society of Midian, Jethro was not only Moses' father-in-law, but also the head of the household, under whose authority Moses had lived for 40 years. Seeking his blessing before departing reflected respect rather than obligation alone. It also demonstrates how deeply Moses had been shaped by life in Midian. The former prince who once acted independently now approached his elder with humility. Jethro's response was brief but deeply meaningful. He simply answered, "Go in peace." The biblical text records no attempt to persuade Moses to remain, no expression of resentment over losing a trusted member of the household, and no lengthy discussion questioning the wisdom of such a dangerous journey. Instead, Jethro released him with words of peace and blessing. Those 3 words reveal a remarkable level of trust. Whether Jethro fully understood everything Moses had experienced at Horeb is impossible to determine from the text. What Scripture does reveal is that he neither resisted nor hindered Moses' departure. The household that had provided refuge for an exhausted fugitive now willingly released him to face the greatest challenge of his life. Moses gathered Zipporah and their sons and prepared to return toward Egypt, retracing the path he had traveled 4 decades earlier under entirely different circumstances. The first journey had been marked by fear, failure, and uncertainty. This second journey began with a divine commission, a shepherd's staff, and the quiet blessing of the Midianite priest who had unknowingly spent 40 years preparing God's chosen servant for the mission that now lay ahead. Once Moses departed from Midian, the biblical narrative follows him almost exclusively through the dramatic events that unfolded in Egypt, leaving Jethro entirely absent from the story for several chapters. The silence, however, should not be mistaken for irrelevance. While Scripture does not record Jethro's thoughts during this period, it does provide enough evidence to understand how the astonishing news from Egypt would eventually reach Midian, and why it profoundly affected the respected priest who had once welcomed an unknown refugee into his home. The ancient Near East was far more interconnected than modern readers often imagine. Long-distance trade routes linked Egypt with Canaan, the Sinai Peninsula, Midian, and Arabia through a constant movement of merchants, shepherds, diplomats, and caravan leaders. News of extraordinary political upheaval rarely remained confined within national borders for long, especially when it involved one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. Egypt's economy depended heavily upon regional commerce, and any disruption affecting agriculture, labor, or government would inevitably become known throughout neighboring territories. According to the Book of Exodus, Moses returned to Egypt carrying nothing that resembled military power. He possessed no army, no political office, and no wealth capable of challenging Pharaoh. Instead, he arrived with a message from the God of Israel, demanding that Pharaoh release the Hebrew people to worship in the wilderness. From a political perspective, the request appeared insignificant. From Pharaoh's perspective, granting It would have meant surrendering a vast labor force that contributed to Egypt's economy and state-building projects. The confrontation, therefore, became far more than a disagreement between two individuals. It developed into a direct conflict between Pharaoh's absolute authority and the God who claimed sovereignty over Israel. Moses and Aaron repeatedly stood before the Egyptian ruler, delivering the same divine command, only to face repeated refusal. Each rejection was followed by another plague that struck the land with increasing severity. The Nile turned to blood. Frogs covered the country. Gnats and flies spread across the land. Livestock died. Painful boils afflicted people and animals. Destructive hail devastated crops. Locusts consumed what remained. Darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. And finally, the death of the firstborn shattered every household that had resisted God's warning. Throughout these events, the biblical narrative consistently attributes the plagues to God's deliberate acts rather than natural coincidence, presenting them as demonstrations of divine authority over Egypt's rulers. Religious symbols and apparent sources of security. Whether every detail of these events became immediately known in Midian cannot be established with certainty. Yet the cumulative impact certainly could not remain hidden indefinitely. Egypt was the dominant regional power of its age, a sequence of unprecedented disasters affecting its agriculture, livestock, population, and political stability would have generated widespread discussion across the ancient Near East. Caravans traveling between Egypt and Arabia would carry reports from eyewitnesses. Merchants would exchange stories at desert encampments, and neighboring tribes would seek to understand how a seemingly invincible empire had been brought to its knees. For someone like Jethro, whose responsibilities included guiding a tribal community connected to regional trade routes, such developments would have been impossible to ignore. The most astonishing report would have come after Pharaoh finally permitted the Israelites to leave. Exodus describes how an immense multitude departed Egypt under Moses' leadership, ending generations of slavery in a single decisive moment. Yet, even that dramatic liberation did not conclude the story. Pharaoh soon regretted his decision and pursued the Israelites with chariots and soldiers toward the shores of the Red Sea. Trapped between the advancing Egyptian army and the waters before them, Israel appeared to face certain destruction. According to the biblical account, God instructed Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea, whereupon the waters divided, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground. When the Egyptian forces attempted to follow, the waters returned, overwhelming Pharaoh's army. From Israel's perspective, this event became the defining moment of national deliverance. From the perspective of surrounding nations, it represented something equally extraordinary. The greatest military power in the region had suffered a catastrophic defeat while pursuing an unarmed population of former slaves. News of such an event would naturally spread with remarkable speed because it fundamentally altered the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Sinai region. Later biblical books repeatedly demonstrate that neighboring peoples heard about these events. Decades afterward, Rahab of Jericho declared that the inhabitants of Canaan had learned how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for Israel. This testimony illustrates that reports of the Exodus traveled far beyond Israel itself, reaching distant populations through the networks of communication that connected the ancient world. If the people of Jericho knew of these events years later, It is entirely reasonable that Midian, located much closer to the route of Israel's journey, would also receive accounts of what had happened. The biblical text itself confirms this expectation when Jethro later tells Moses that he has heard about everything God had done for Moses and for Israel in delivering them from Egypt. That statement becomes the key through which readers understand Jethro's perspective during this otherwise silent period. He did not witness the plagues firsthand, nor did he stand beside the shores of the Red Sea. His understanding came through reliable reports that gradually revealed the astonishing transformation of the man who had once lived under his roof. The refugee who had entered Midian seeking protection had become the leader of an entire nation. The shepherd who had cared for Jethro's flocks now stood at the center of one of history's most remarkable acts of deliverance. Equally significant was the growing revelation concerning the God whom Moses served. Before Moses left Midian, Jethro knew him primarily as a trustworthy son-in-law. During the Exodus, Moses became known throughout the region as the representative of a God whose power appeared unlike anything the surrounding nations had previously encountered. Ancient peoples generally understood military victories and natural disasters within religious frameworks, believing that national fortunes reflected the strength of their gods. The collapse of Egyptian resistance therefore carried theological implications, as well as political ones, for observers outside Israel. The question extended beyond how the Hebrews escaped slavery. It also became a question of who this God was, whose authority seemed capable of humbling the mightiest kingdom on earth. The biblical narrative deliberately allows readers to anticipate Jethro's response without revealing it immediately. Instead of interrupting the Exodus story with scenes in Midian, Scripture preserves his reaction until the moment when he personally meets Moses again. This literary choice creates dramatic anticipation. Readers know that Jethro has heard extraordinary reports, but they do not yet know how he will interpret them. Will he remain loyal to the traditions of Midian alone, dismissing the reports as exaggeration? Will he question Moses' account? Or will the evidence persuade him that the God of Israel has acted in ways that demand recognition beyond the boundaries of one nation? Those questions remain unanswered as Israel continues its journey through the wilderness. Only after the people arrive near Mount Sinai does the narrative once again bring Jethro into view, setting the stage for one of the most significant reunions in the book of Exodus, where the Midianite priest will encounter not the weary fugitive he once sheltered, but the divinely appointed leader through whom God has transformed the destiny of an entire people. By the time Jethro re-entered the biblical narrative, nearly every aspect of Moses' life had changed. The man who had once arrived in Midian exhausted, alone, and pursued by Pharaoh, had become the recognized leader of an entire nation. Israel had crossed the Red Sea, journeyed through the wilderness, defeated the Amalekites at Rephidim, and finally encamped before the mountain of God in the wilderness of Sinai. It was here, at the very place where Moses had first encountered the burning bush years earlier, that two stories separated by 4 decades converged once again. Exodus 18 opens by explaining that Jethro, the priest of Midian and Moses' father-in-law, heard about everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, especially how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. The emphasis falls not merely upon Moses' achievements, but upon God's actions. The reports reaching Midian had made it unmistakably clear that the Exodus was understood as an act of divine intervention, rather than human military success. Having heard these accounts, Jethro set out for the Israelite camp, bringing with him Zipporah, Moses' wife, whom Moses had previously sent back, along with their 2 sons, Gershom and Eleazar. Exodus does not explain precisely when or why Zipporah and the children had returned to Midian after leaving with Moses at the beginning of his journey to Egypt. Various explanations have been proposed throughout Jewish and Christian tradition. Some suggest Moses sent them back before the confrontation with Pharaoh, intensified in order to protect them from the dangers surrounding the mission. Others believe they returned after the mysterious incident recorded in Exodus 4, when Zipporah circumcised their son during a nighttime encounter on the journey to Egypt. The biblical text itself offers no direct explanation, and responsible interpretation recognizes this uncertainty, rather than treating later traditions as established historical fact. What Scripture clearly states is that when Jethro traveled to Sinai, he did not come alone. He brought Moses' family with him, making the journey not only a diplomatic visit, but also a deeply personal reunion after years of separation. Before arriving at the camp, Jethro sent a message announcing his approach. Moses immediately went out to meet him. The details of their greeting reveal the profound respect that continued to define their relationship, despite everything that had changed since they last saw one another. Moses bowed before Jethro and kissed him. Following the customary expressions of honor common throughout the ancient Near East, they greeted one another warmly and entered the tent together. The narrative is striking because Moses, despite now leading hundreds of thousands of Israelites and serving as God's chosen spokesman before Pharaoh, did not approach Jethro with royal dignity or prophetic distance. Instead, he greeted him as a grateful son-in-law honoring the elder who had once provided refuge, employment, and family during the darkest years of his life. Leadership had transformed Moses' responsibilities, but it had not erased his humility or his appreciation for those who had shaped his journey. Once inside the tent, Moses recounted everything that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to Egypt for Israel's sake, along with all the hardships they had experienced along the way and how the Lord had delivered them. This summary is significant because it reminds readers that the Exodus story was not simply a sequence of spectacular miracles. Moses also spoke of the difficulties encountered during the journey, including the challenges that had tested Israel's faith before reaching Sinai. The narrative, therefore, presents an honest testimony that combines divine victories with human struggles. Such balance gives credibility to Moses' account and underscores that God's faithfulness had been demonstrated not only through dramatic interventions, but also through continual preservation during uncertain circumstances. Jethro listened as someone hearing the complete story directly from the one who had lived it. The reports circulating through trade routes and neighboring tribes had prepared him for this meeting, but first-hand testimony carried a different weight. The refugee who had once entered his household now described how God had confronted the greatest empire of the age, liberated an enslaved nation, defeated pursuing armies, provided food and water in the wilderness, and preserved his people through every stage of their journey. For Jethro, this conversation was not merely an exchange of news. It represented the unfolding of events that connected his own household to one of the defining acts of divine redemption in biblical history. The setting of this reunion also carries profound theological significance. They met at the mountain where Moses had first received his calling. Years earlier, Moses had stood there alone as a shepherd tending Jethro's flock, uncertain of his own abilities and reluctant to accept God's commission. Now he returned to the same region, leading the people whom God had promised to deliver. The promise given at the burning bush had included a specific sign. After bringing the people out of Egypt, they would worship God on this very mountain. Jethro's arrival at Sinai therefore occurred at a moment when God's earlier promises had already begun to reach fulfillment. The place that had marked the beginning of Moses' mission now became the setting where one of the people most closely connected to his years of preparation witnessed the outcome of that calling. Equally remarkable is the way Exodus presents Jethro himself. Despite being identified once again as the priest of Midian, he enters Israel's camp peacefully and is welcomed with honor. There is no indication of suspicion, hostility, or ethnic division. Although Jethro belonged to a different people, he was received as a respected guest because of his relationship with Moses and because of his evident interest in the works of Israel's God. This hospitality reflects an important theme running throughout the Old Testament. God's covenant with Israel established a unique national identity. Yet, it did not prevent individuals from other nations from recognizing his greatness or participating respectfully in significant moments of Israel's history. Jethro's presence illustrates that the biblical narrative consistently leaves room for faithful responses from those outside Israel, without diminishing Israel's unique covenant role. Another subtle but important feature of this reunion lies in what the text chooses not to emphasize. There is no lengthy conversation about Moses' years in Midian, no reflection on the shepherding days that had once defined his life, and no nostalgia for the past. Instead, every conversation quickly turns toward what God has accomplished. The focus shifts away from personal memories and toward divine action. This literary choice reinforces one of Exodus's central messages. The story is ultimately not about the greatness of Moses or even the wisdom of Jethro. It is about the faithfulness of God working through ordinary people whose lives become part of a far larger purpose. Moses' past in Midian mattered because it prepared him for obedience. Jethro's role mattered because he responded thoughtfully to what God had done. Their relationship remained important, but it now served a greater narrative centered on God's redemption of Israel. As evening approached over the Israelite camp at Sinai, Jethro had heard the complete testimony directly from Moses himself. He had seen the reunited family, observed the people whom God had delivered, and stood among a nation whose existence had been transformed by events unlike any recorded in the history of the ancient world. Yet, his most memorable response had not yet been spoken. The priest of Midian had listened carefully, weighed everything he had heard, and was now prepared to offer a declaration that would become one of the clearest acknowledgments in the book of Exodus, from a man who did not belong to Israel by birth, but who nevertheless recognized the unmistakable greatness of the God who had delivered them from Egypt. After listening to Moses recount everything that had taken place from the day he left Midian until Israel's arrival at Mount Sinai, Jethro finally spoke. His response occupies only a few verses in Exodus 18, yet those words have attracted the attention of biblical scholars, theologians, and historians for centuries, because they represent one of the clearest testimonies about the God of Israel offered by a prominent non-Israelite during the Exodus narrative. before making any theological declaration. However, Jethro reacted with something deeply human. Exodus states that he rejoiced because of all the good the Lord had done for Israel in delivering them from the hand of the Egyptians. The Hebrew expression conveys more than polite satisfaction. It describes genuine joy arising from the recognition that suffering had been overcome through divine intervention. Jethro's first response was therefore not intellectual analysis, but heartfelt celebration. He rejoiced that an enslaved people had been set free, that oppression had been broken, and that the God whom Moses served had acted decisively on behalf of those who cried out to him. This emotional response is significant because it demonstrates that Jethro did not approach the Exodus merely as an observer evaluating remarkable events. He entered into the joy of those who had experienced God's deliverance. Only after expressing that joy did he offer the declaration for which he is best remembered. He proclaimed, "Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because he did this when the Egyptians acted arrogantly against the people." These words deserve careful attention, because every phrase contributes to their meaning. Jethro begins by blessing the Lord, acknowledging that Israel's rescue cannot be explained simply through Moses' leadership or historical circumstance. The deliverance belongs ultimately to God. He then repeats the language of rescue several times, emphasizing that freedom from Egypt resulted from divine action rather than human achievement. Finally, he reaches the conclusion toward which his entire statement has been moving. "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods." Among interpreters, this sentence has generated considerable discussion. Does Jethro mean that he has abandoned every previous religious belief and accepted exclusive worship of the God of Israel? Or is he expressing the ancient Near Eastern conviction that Israel's God has demonstrated himself supreme in this particular historical event? The biblical text itself does not answer every question modern readers might ask, which is why careful interpretation requires distinguishing between what Scripture explicitly says and what later traditions have inferred. The statement, "Now I know," indicates that Jethro's understanding has reached a new stage because of what he has heard and witnessed. Whether this marks a complete conversion in the later theological sense or a profound acknowledgement of God's incomparable greatness remains a subject of scholarly discussion. Jewish interpreters across history have often viewed Jethro as a sincere convert who recognized the truth of Israel's God. Some rabbinic traditions even portray him as abandoning every form of idolatry after hearing about the Exodus. Early Christian writers likewise frequently treated Jethro as an example of a Gentile who responded faithfully to God's revelation before the inclusion of the nations described in the New Testament. At the same time, many contemporary biblical scholars urge caution, noting that the Old Testament often records foreign rulers acknowledging the greatness of Israel's God without necessarily providing detailed descriptions of their lifelong religious commitments. The text itself simply records Jethro's confession and allows its power to stand without further explanation. What cannot be disputed is the remarkable content of his conclusion. Jethro attributes God's greatness specifically to his intervention against Egyptian arrogance. This observation reflects one of the central theological themes running throughout Exodus. Pharaoh repeatedly exalted his own authority above God's command, refusing to release Israel despite repeated warnings and increasingly severe judgments. The Exodus therefore became not merely a rescue operation, but also a demonstration that human pride cannot ultimately resist divine sovereignty. Jethro recognized that the conflict had never been a contest between Moses and Pharaoh alone. It was a revelation of the Lord's authority over every earthly power that claimed absolute control. By identifying Egyptian arrogance as the context for God's victory, Jethro showed that he understood the deeper meaning behind the miracles, rather than viewing them simply as displays of supernatural power. His declaration also carries remarkable significance within the broader biblical narrative, because it comes from outside Israel. Throughout the Old Testament, the covenant people repeatedly struggle with doubt, fear, and disobedience, despite witnessing God's mighty works firsthand. Here, however, a Midianite priest who learned about these events through testimony responds with gratitude, praise, and theological insight. The narrative does not present this contrast to diminish Israel, but to emphasize the universal significance of God's actions. The Exodus was performed on behalf of Israel, yet its impact extended far beyond Israel's borders. Neighboring nations heard what God had done, and some, like Jethro, responded by acknowledging his greatness. This fulfills an important dimension of God's covenant with Abraham, through whom all the families of the earth were ultimately to be blessed. Jethro's confession, therefore, serves as an early indication that God's redemptive purposes were never intended to remain hidden from the nations. His response also reveals something about the kind of man he had always been. Throughout the narrative, Jethro consistently demonstrates intellectual honesty and moral humility. When Moses first arrived in Midian, Jethro judged him according to his character, rather than his appearance or social status. Decades later, after hearing about God's work in Egypt, he again responded according to the evidence before him, rather than defending preconceived assumptions. There is no hint of jealousy that the refugee he once sheltered has become the leader of a nation. Nor does he attempt to compete with Moses for spiritual authority. Instead, Jethro allows the truth of God's actions to reshape his own understanding. Such openness is one reason his brief appearance leaves such a lasting impression. He exemplifies the wisdom of a leader, willing to recognize truth wherever it is revealed. The narrative's literary structure further strengthens the importance of his confession. Before Jethro offers any practical advice concerning leadership in the following section, Exodus first establishes his spiritual response to God's saving work. His wisdom concerning administration does not stand independently of his theology. It follows his recognition that the Lord has acted with sovereign authority in history. In other words, the biblical author presents Jethro first as a man who understands who God is before presenting him as a counselor whose advice deserves careful attention. That order is significant because it grounds everything that follows in reverence for God's work, rather than merely in human experience. Readers, therefore, encounter Jethro not simply as an experienced tribal elder, but as someone whose perspective has been transformed by recognizing the greatness of the God who delivered Israel. As the conversation between Moses and Jethro continued, words alone no longer seemed sufficient to express what had just been confessed. In the ancient world, significant declarations about God were often followed by acts of worship that gave visible expression to inward conviction. The Midianite priest who had publicly blessed the Lord would now take part in a remarkable gathering unlike any previously recorded in his life, joining Moses, Aaron, and the elders of Israel in an act that symbolized fellowship before the God whose mighty deeds had united people from different nations around a shared acknowledgement of his sovereign power. Jethro's declaration of faith did not end with words. In the ancient world, profound convictions were often expressed through visible acts of worship, and Exodus 18 immediately records that the priest of Midian brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. The narrative moves naturally from confession to worship, demonstrating that genuine recognition of God's greatness called for a tangible response. This moment is remarkable not because sacrifices were uncommon in the ancient Near East, but because of the unique gathering that surrounded them. Present at the meal were Jethro, Moses, Aaron, and all the elders of Israel, who came together to eat in the presence of God. Although the biblical text describes the event with striking brevity, its theological and historical significance is considerable. It is one of the earliest recorded occasions in which a respected non-Israelite participates in an act of worship that acknowledges the God of Israel while sharing table fellowship with the nation's spiritual leaders. The timing of this event deserves careful attention. Israel had arrived at Sinai, but the covenant at Mount Sinai had not yet been formally established. The 10 Commandments had not yet been given, the tabernacle had not yet been constructed, and the Levitical priesthood had not yet been inaugurated. Readers familiar with the later books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers can easily assume that the detailed sacrificial regulations were already in place, yet the narrative itself shows otherwise. This gathering occurred during a transitional period in Israel's history, before the elaborate system of worship described later in the Pentateuch. Consequently, Jethro's participation should not be measured against laws that had not yet been revealed. Instead, the account reflects a stage in biblical history when patriarchal patterns of sacrifice still provided the primary framework for expressing devotion to God. Earlier, figures such as Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had all offered sacrifices long before the establishment of the Levitical system. Jethro's offering, therefore, stands comfortably within that earlier biblical tradition. The text specifically mentions a burnt offering, followed by additional sacrifices. In the Old Testament, burnt offerings symbolized complete dedication to God because the entire animal was consumed upon the altar. Other sacrifices often culminated in a shared meal, expressing peace, gratitude, fellowship, and restored relationships before God. While Exodus does not explain every detail of the ceremony, the sequence strongly suggests that worship was followed by communal fellowship. The meal itself becomes one of the narrative's most important features. Eating together carried profound significance throughout the ancient Near East. Shared meals established trust, confirmed peaceful relationships, strengthened alliances, and expressed mutual respect. To eat in someone's presence was to acknowledge a bond that extended beyond mere acquaintance. Here, however, the meal takes place before God, indicating that the fellowship enjoyed among the participants rested upon a shared recognition of the Lord's presence, rather than merely upon family ties. Moses and Jethro were related through marriage, but the gathering included Aaron and the elders as well, expanding the occasion beyond private family celebration into a moment of communal significance for Israel itself. One of the most striking aspects of this scene is the complete absence of tension, considering Israel's later struggles concerning foreign influence. Readers might expect hesitation toward the presence of a Midianite priest. Instead, Exodus portrays Jethro as an honored guest whose worship and fellowship are received without controversy. The narrative offers no indication that Aaron or the elders questioned his presence at the table. This harmony reflects the unique circumstances surrounding Jethro's visit. He had publicly blessed the Lord, acknowledged his supremacy over every competing claim to authority, and come not as a rival religious leader, but as one who rejoiced in God's saving work. The focus remains entirely upon the Lord's deliverance of Israel, creating unity rather than division among those gathered. Modern discussions sometimes ask whether Jethro himself officiated the sacrifices, or whether Moses or another individual performed the ritual acts. The biblical text simply states that Jethro brought the offerings. It does not explicitly describe each ceremonial role, nor does it attempt to answer questions that later generations would naturally raise after the establishment of Israel's priesthood. Responsible interpretation, therefore, resists going beyond what Scripture records. The narrative's primary concern is not assigning ceremonial responsibilities, but emphasizing the shared worship that followed Jethro's confession. By avoiding unnecessary detail, the text directs readers toward the theological meaning of the event rather than its procedural mechanics. Equally significant is the presence of Aaron at this gathering. Although Aaron would soon become Israel's first high priest, that office had not yet been formally established. His participation alongside Moses, Jethro, and the elders anticipates the leadership structure that would soon develop after the giving of the law. The elders likewise represent the emerging national leadership of Israel. Their inclusion demonstrates that this was not an isolated family reunion, but a gathering involving the recognized representatives of the covenant community. The meal, therefore, serves as a bridge between Israel's deliverance from Egypt and the covenant relationship that God was about to establish at Sinai. From a literary perspective, the placement of this episode is equally important. Exodus intentionally presents worship before administration, before readers encounter Jethro's famous advice regarding leadership. They first witness a scene centered on gratitude, fellowship, and reverence for God. This order subtly communicates a principle that resonates throughout Scripture. Healthy leadership begins not with organizational skill, but with proper recognition of God's authority. Jethro does not arrive at Sinai intending to reform Israel's governmental structure. His first concern is to hear what God has done, rejoice in that deliverance, confess God's greatness, and participate in worship. Only afterward does he begin observing the practical realities of Moses' daily responsibilities. The sequence reflects remarkable wisdom. Worship establishes the proper perspective from which practical counsel can emerge. Historical context further enriches this moment. Shared sacrificial meals were common throughout many cultures of the ancient Near East, often serving to strengthen tribal alliances or confirm agreements between families. Yet, the biblical narrative transforms this familiar cultural practice into something distinct. The unity expressed here does not arise from political convenience or economic partnership, but from acknowledgement of God's redemptive work. Jethro had nothing to gain materially from Israel's deliverance. He arrived not seeking influence, territory, or reward. His presence reflects genuine appreciation for what God had accomplished and sincere affection for the family into which Moses had married. That absence of self-interest gives the entire episode an atmosphere of remarkable authenticity. It also prepares readers to understand the motivation behind the counsel Jethro will soon offer. His advice will not be driven by ambition or the desire to exercise authority over Israel. Instead, It will emerge from compassionate concern after observing the burdens carried by Moses. The shared meal concludes one phase of Jethro's visit and quietly prepares for the next. Around the table, celebration naturally focused upon God's mighty acts in Egypt and the wilderness. Yet, when the meal ended and ordinary responsibilities resumed, Jethro remained in the Israelite camp long enough to observe Moses performing his daily work. The following morning, the experienced priest and tribal leader watched as people began gathering before Moses from sunrise until sunset, each bringing disputes, questions, and requests for judgment. What Jethro witnessed that day would reveal a problem that neither the miracles of the Exodus nor the joy of Israel's deliverance had solved, and it would prompt one of the most practical and enduring conversations about leadership found anywhere in the Old Testament. The morning after the shared sacrifice and fellowship meal, life in the Israelite camp returned to its normal rhythm. The celebration of God's mighty acts gave way to the practical realities of leading an enormous community that had only recently emerged from slavery. For Moses, this transition was immediate. The miraculous events of the Exodus had established him as Israel's unquestioned leader, but miracles alone could not resolve the countless challenges of governing a nation in the wilderness. Every day brought disputes between neighbors, questions about property, conflicts within families, disagreements over responsibilities, and the countless practical concerns that naturally arise whenever hundreds of thousands of people live together under difficult conditions. Exodus 18 provides one of the Bible's most realistic portraits of leadership by shifting attention away from dramatic miracles and focusing instead on the exhausting demands of ordinary administration. Jethro observed Moses taking his place to judge the people, and the Israelites stood around him from morning until evening. The image is both simple and overwhelming. A seemingly endless line of individuals waited for an opportunity to present their cases before a single man. The Hebrew text suggests continuity rather than a brief meeting. This was not an isolated, busy day, but the established pattern by which Israel's affairs were being managed. Every significant question eventually found its way to Moses, because he alone possessed the authority, experience, and recognized relationship with God necessary to resolve it. At first glance, such a system may have appeared admirable. Moses was wise, trusted, and uniquely qualified for his role. Yet, Jethro immediately recognized a problem hidden beneath those very strengths. The nation had become dependent upon one individual for virtually every important decision. The greater Moses' faithfulness, the heavier his burden became. The more the people trusted him, the less responsibility anyone else assumed. Success itself had created the conditions for an approaching crisis. This observation reveals one of the narrative's greatest insights. Leadership problems do not always arise from incompetence or failure. Sometimes they emerge because capable leaders continue accepting responsibilities that eventually exceed the limits of any one person. Moses was not neglecting his duties. On the contrary, he was working tirelessly to meet every need presented before him. His willingness to serve had become so complete that he appeared to carry the entire administrative life of Israel upon his own shoulders. Jethro, however, possessed decades of experience leading his own community in Midian. Although the scale differed enormously, he understood a principle that transcended the size of any organization. No human leader, regardless of wisdom or dedication, can sustain unlimited responsibility indefinitely. Before offering any advice, Jethro simply watched. This detail deserves careful attention because it demonstrates the restraint that consistently characterizes his actions throughout the biblical narrative. He did not interrupt Moses in the middle of his work. He did not criticize the system before understanding it. He observed patiently until he had seen enough to recognize both the strengths and weaknesses of what was taking place. Only then did he begin asking questions. His first inquiry was remarkably direct. "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning until evening?" The question was not an accusation but an invitation for Moses to explain his reasoning. Moses answered by describing the situation from his own perspective. The people came to him because they sought God's will. Whenever disputes arose, they brought them before him, and he judged between one person and another while making known God's statutes and instructions. His explanation reveals that these gatherings involved far more than settling personal disagreements. Moses functioned simultaneously as judge, teacher, interpreter of God's commands, and mediator for the entire nation. Every legal decision also became an opportunity to instruct Israel in the ways of the Lord. In many respects, Moses' approach was understandable. Israel had only recently left Egypt. They possessed no established judicial system, no experienced local officials, and no tradition of self-government as a free nation. Centuries of slavery had denied them opportunities to develop institutions capable of managing their own affairs. Naturally, they turned to the one leader whom God had visibly appointed through the plagues, the Red Sea, and the wilderness journey. Moses had become the central point through which divine guidance reached the people. Yet the very uniqueness of his calling created a dangerous misunderstanding. Because Moses alone had received God's commission, both he and the people gradually assumed that Moses alone must personally resolve every issue. Jethro recognized that these were two entirely different responsibilities. Receiving revelation from God did not require personally administering every dispute within the nation. The distinction appears obvious in hindsight, but it often remains difficult to recognize while living within the pressures of daily leadership. Modern readers frequently admire Moses' dedication, and rightly so. His willingness to spend every waking hour serving others reflects extraordinary commitment. Yet, Exodus does not present relentless exhaustion as an ideal to imitate. Instead, the narrative quietly exposes the hidden cost of a system built around one indispensable individual. Moses undoubtedly believed he was helping the people by remaining constantly available. In reality, both he and the nation were paying an increasingly heavy price. Moses faced physical and emotional exhaustion, while the people endured long delays waiting for access to the only person authorized to resolve their concerns. Justice, even when administered faithfully, becomes inefficient if every case depends upon a single decision-maker. The problem, therefore, extended beyond Moses himself. It affected the well-being of the entire community. Historical context makes Jethro's observation even more impressive. Tribal societies throughout the ancient Near East commonly relied upon elders and respected local leaders to resolve ordinary disputes, reserving only the most difficult cases for higher authorities. Such distributed systems allowed communities to function effectively without overwhelming a single individual, Jethro had likely spent many years overseeing similar arrangements within Midian, where experienced family heads and tribal elders naturally shared responsibilities. His perspective, therefore, combined practical experience with careful observation rather than abstract theory. Importantly, the biblical text never suggests that Moses had intentionally rejected such an approach. Instead, the demands of Israel's unique situation had gradually produced an unhealthy pattern almost without anyone noticing. This aspect of the narrative gives it remarkable realism. Many organizational problems develop not through deliberate mistakes, but through incremental habits that appear reasonable until their cumulative effects become impossible to ignore. Another subtle feature of the passage concerns Jethro's position during this conversation. Although he had publicly acknowledged the greatness of Israel's God, he did not presume spiritual authority over Moses. He did not claim to have received divine revelation concerning Israel's government. He simply observed the practical consequences of the existing system and prepared to offer counsel grounded in wisdom gained through long experience. This distinction is crucial because it explains why Moses remained willing to listen. Jethro approached him neither as a rival prophet nor as a political superior. He spoke as an older, experienced leader who cared deeply for both Moses and the people entrusted to his care. The conversation therefore unfolds within the context of mutual respect rather than confrontation. As the day drew to a close and the long line of waiting Israelites gradually disappeared, Jethro had seen enough to reach a clear conclusion. The problem before him was not Moses' character, his faithfulness, or his commitment to God's calling. The problem was the structure through which that calling was being carried out. Unless something changed, the burden would eventually become unbearable for Moses, while the people themselves would continue suffering under a system unable to meet their growing needs efficiently. Having patiently observed, carefully questioned, and fully understood the situation, Jethro was now prepared to offer a solution whose influence would extend far beyond the wilderness of Sinai, becoming one of the Bible's most enduring lessons on leadership, delegation, and the wise stewardship of responsibility. Having carefully observed Moses from morning until evening and listened patiently to his explanation, Jethro finally spoke with a level of honesty that only a trusted elder could offer. He did not begin by praising Moses' dedication, nor did he soften his words to avoid discomfort. Instead, he addressed the problem directly. What you are doing is not good. For modern readers, the statement may sound surprisingly blunt, especially considering that Moses had been chosen by God to lead Israel. Yet Jethro's words were neither disrespectful nor dismissive. They reflected the wisdom of someone who understood that even faithful leaders can adopt unhealthy patterns without realizing it. His concern was not that Moses lacked commitment. Quite the opposite. Moses was so committed that he had accepted a burden no human being could sustain indefinitely. Jethro continued by explaining the inevitable consequences of the existing system. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The warning is remarkably balanced. Moses was not the only one paying the price. The people suffered as well. Every individual seeking justice had to wait for access to a single leader whose time and energy were inherently limited. Long hours, delayed decisions, and growing dependence upon one person created a situation that harmed everyone involved. Leadership, Jethro recognized, should strengthen a community rather than exhaust both the leader and those being led. His diagnosis reveals an extraordinary understanding of human limitations, one that remains strikingly relevant across cultures and centuries, rather than treating exhaustion as evidence of faithfulness. Jethro identified it as a sign that the system itself required change. He then explained why. "The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone." These words acknowledge an important truth about leadership that Scripture consistently affirms elsewhere. God often calls individuals to unique responsibilities, but He rarely intends them to carry every responsibility alone. Moses' calling was exceptional, yet his humanity remained unchanged. He still required rest, perspective, and the support of others. By reminding Moses of his limitations, Jethro was not diminishing his role. He was protecting it. A leader overwhelmed by responsibilities eventually loses the ability to fulfill the very mission God has entrusted to him. Having identified the problem, Jethro proposed a solution that displayed remarkable organizational insight. He first reaffirmed Moses' unique position rather than replacing it. Moses should continue serving as the people's representative before God, bringing their concerns to the Lord and teaching them His statutes and laws. In other words, the responsibilities that only Moses could fulfill should remain exclusively his. Jethro did not suggest transferring divine revelation or covenant leadership to someone else. Those tasks belonged uniquely to Moses because God had appointed him for that purpose. The problem lay elsewhere. Moses had also assumed countless responsibilities that capable others could perform. Jethro therefore distinguished between responsibilities that required Moses personally and responsibilities that could be faithfully shared. This distinction forms the heart of his advice. Instead of attempting to resolve every dispute himself, Moses should select capable men from among the people and appoint them over groups of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. These leaders would judge ordinary cases, while only the most difficult matters would be brought before Moses. Such an arrangement would dramatically reduce Moses' daily burden while making justice more accessible throughout the nation. The proposal was revolutionary, not because delegation itself was unknown in the ancient world, but because it restructured the leadership of an entire covenant community around shared responsibility without diminishing God's chosen leader. Jethro also specified the character required for those who would serve. They were to be capable men who feared God, were trustworthy, and hated dishonest gain. This list deserves careful attention because it places moral integrity ahead of administrative ability. Competence alone was insufficient. Leaders responsible for judging others needed reverence for God, personal honesty, and freedom from corruption. In societies where legal decisions could easily be influenced by bribery, family loyalty, or political pressure, these qualities were essential. Jethro understood that decentralizing authority without ensuring trustworthy character would simply replace one problem with another. His emphasis therefore reveals that effective leadership depends not merely upon organizational structures, but upon the integrity of those entrusted with responsibility. The order of his qualifications is equally instructive. Fear of God comes first, reminding readers that true justice begins with accountability to a higher authority. Trustworthiness follows because people cannot confidently submit to leaders whose integrity is uncertain. Finally, hatred of dishonest gain protects the entire system from corruption. Together, these qualities establish a moral foundation capable of sustaining delegated authority. Jethro's wisdom extended beyond administration into a profound understanding of human nature. People naturally imitate the priorities demonstrated by their leaders. If those entrusted with judgment pursued personal advantage rather than justice, the entire community would eventually reflect those same values. By insisting upon godly character before public responsibility, Jethro anticipated principles that later became central throughout both the Old and New Testaments. Another remarkable feature of Jethro's counsel lies in the humility with which he presented it. He did not command Moses to implement the plan. Instead, he offered it respectfully while acknowledging God's ultimate authority. If you do this, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people also will go to their place in peace. That single phrase demonstrates extraordinary wisdom. Although Jethro possessed decades of leadership experience, he recognized that Israel was not his nation to govern. Moses answered directly to God, not to his father-in-law. Therefore, even the best practical advice required confirmation within the framework of God's will. Jethro neither presumed divine authority nor attempted to substitute his experience for God's direction. He understood the proper limits of his own role. This humility strengthens rather than weakens his counsel, because it reveals a man confident enough to offer wisdom without demanding control. The anticipated results of Jethro's proposal were equally balanced. Moses would be able to endure, and the people would return home in peace. Leadership reform, therefore, served both the leader and the community simultaneously. Too often, organizational changes benefit one group at the expense of another. Jethro envisioned a system where faithful delegation preserved Moses' strength while providing more timely justice for Israel. His objective was not efficiency alone, but the well-being of the entire covenant community. This concern reflects the perspective of someone who had spent decades guiding people, rather than merely managing tasks. From a broader biblical perspective, Jethro's advice also illustrates God's willingness to use wisdom acquired through ordinary human experience. Nothing in the passage suggests that Jethro received a special prophetic revelation concerning Israel's administrative structure. His proposal emerged from observation, practical knowledge, and thoughtful reflection. Yet Scripture preserves his counsel because wisdom itself is recognized as one of God's gifts. Throughout the Bible, divine guidance often works not only through miracles and prophetic messages, but also through careful reasoning exercised by people who fear God. Jethro's role reminds readers that practical wisdom and faithful obedience are not competing realities. They frequently work together. His contribution also highlights the unique relationship between Moses and Jethro. Years earlier, Jethro had welcomed a broken refugee into his household. Now, he spoke to the leader of a nation with the same honesty and care that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Success had not eliminated Moses' need for wise counsel, nor had it prevented Jethro from speaking difficult truths. Their conversation stands as a powerful example of leadership, shaped by humility on both sides. Jethro possessed enough courage to address a serious problem. Moses possessed enough humility to listen. The effectiveness of the advice ultimately depended upon that rare combination. As Jethro finished speaking, the future direction of Israel's leadership rested entirely upon Moses' response. The proposal was practical, compassionate, and deeply rooted in wisdom. But it remained only counsel until the man chosen by God decided whether to embrace it. The next chapter would reveal that one of the greatest qualities distinguishing Moses was not merely his ability to lead, but his willingness to learn. Even from a Midianite priest who had once sheltered him as an unknown shepherd in exile. One of the most remarkable features of Exodus 18 is not simply that Jethro offered wise advice, but that Moses accepted it. Throughout the ancient world, rulers were rarely known for welcoming criticism, especially after achieving extraordinary success. Moses had confronted Pharaoh, witnessed the 10 plagues, stretched out his staff over the Red Sea, led Israel through the wilderness, and served as the man through whom God revealed his will to the nation. Humanly speaking, he possessed every reason to dismiss the observations of someone outside Israel's leadership structure. Yet the biblical narrative records no argument, no defensiveness, and no attempt to protect his own authority. Instead, Exodus states with striking simplicity, Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. That single sentence reveals as much about Moses' character as any miracle recorded in the book of Exodus. The willingness to receive correction after great success is often a far greater test of character than the willingness to obey during times of hardship. Many leaders accept guidance while they are still learning, but gradually become resistant as their influence grows. Moses followed the opposite path. The greater his responsibility became, the more willing he remained to recognize that wisdom could come through another person. This humility had not appeared suddenly at Sinai. It had been cultivated over decades. 40 years earlier, Moses had attempted to deliver his people through his own initiative and strength, believing he understood both the problem and its solution. The result had been failure, rejection, and exile. Those years in Midian fundamentally reshaped him. Shepherding Jethro's flocks taught patience where ambition had once dominated. Living under another man's household taught submission where privilege had once defined his position. By the time God called him from the burning bush, Moses repeatedly questioned his own adequacy rather than assuming his own capability. Although God transformed him into Israel's leader, he did not remove the humility that had grown through years of preparation. Exodus 18 demonstrates that this humility remained one of Moses' greatest strengths long after the miracles of Egypt. The advice itself also helps explain why Moses listened. Jethro had not questioned God's calling, challenged Moses' authority, or attempted to alter Israel's covenant relationship with the Lord. Instead, he focused entirely upon the practical structure through which Moses carried out responsibilities God had already entrusted to him. Moses could therefore evaluate the proposal without feeling that his divine commission was under attack. Jethro sought to preserve Moses' ministry rather than replace it. That distinction mattered enormously. Wise counsel often becomes easier to receive when it aims to strengthen a person's calling instead of competing with it. Moses recognized that Jethro's concern arose from genuine care for both him and the people of Israel, rather than personal ambition. Another important factor was the relationship between the two men. Jethro was not a stranger offering unsolicited opinions after observing Moses for a single afternoon. He was the elder who had welcomed Moses into his home when he possessed nothing, entrusted him with responsibility over the family flocks, given him Zipporah in marriage, and watched him mature throughout 40 years in Midian. Their relationship had been built long before Moses became Israel's leader. Because trust already existed, difficult conversations could occur without threatening mutual respect. This reflects a timeless principle found throughout Scripture. Honest correction is most effective when offered within relationships marked by proven faithfulness and genuine love. Jethro earned the right to speak into Moses' life because he had already invested decades in caring for him. Moses also understood something many leaders struggle to accept. Agreeing with wise advice does not diminish authority. In fact, the opposite is often true. Leaders who refuse every suggestion eventually become isolated, while those willing to learn strengthen both themselves and the communities they serve. By accepting Jethro's counsel, Moses demonstrated confidence rooted not in personal pride but in God's calling. His authority did not depend upon pretending to possess every answer. It rested upon faithfully fulfilling the role God had assigned him. Delegating responsibilities, therefore, represented neither weakness nor failure. It represented obedience to wisdom that enabled him to concentrate upon the unique mission only he could accomplish. The narrative immediately shows Moses putting the advice into practice. He selected capable men from all Israel and appointed them as leaders over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. These men judged ordinary disputes, while only the difficult cases came before Moses. The biblical text offers no indication of prolonged hesitation or partial implementation. Moses moved decisively because he recognized the value of what had been proposed. At the same time, the implementation reflects careful discernment rather than blind acceptance. Jethro had recommended selecting individuals who feared God, were trustworthy, and rejected dishonest gain. Moses chose leaders who met those standards, ensuring that the new structure rested upon character as well as competence. The resulting system accomplished exactly what Jethro had envisioned. Ordinary matters could now be resolved closer to the people involved, reducing unnecessary delays while preserving Moses' energy for responsibilities requiring his direct attention. Difficult cases still reached Moses, maintaining his unique role as Israel's covenant mediator. The administrative burden became distributed without fragmenting national leadership. In this way, delegation strengthened rather than weakened unity. Moses remained Israel's leader, yet leadership itself was no longer confined to one exhausted individual. Scholars have often noted that Exodus 18 appears before the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, creating an important literary sequence. Israel first receives an effective leadership structure, and only afterward receives the covenant legislation that will shape its national life. This order is significant because laws require faithful administration if they are to serve the community well. Without capable judges and trustworthy local leaders, even the wisest legal code becomes difficult to apply consistently. Jethro's advice, therefore, prepared Israel institutionally for what was about to unfold. Once the covenant was established, the nation would already possess a framework through which God's instructions could be communicated and disputes could be resolved. The passage also challenges a common misunderstanding about biblical leadership. Scripture never presents great leaders as individuals who accomplish everything alone. Moses worked alongside Aaron, Miriam, Joshua, the elders, and eventually the judges appointed throughout Israel. David relied upon mighty men, military commanders, priests, and prophetic counselors. The apostles in the New Testament appointed deacons so they could devote themselves to prayer and the ministry of the Word. Again and again, the Bible portrays shared responsibility as an expression of wisdom rather than weakness. Moses' acceptance of Jethro's counsel therefore fits within a much larger biblical pattern in which God accomplishes his purposes through communities of faithful servants, rather than isolated heroes. There is also an important spiritual dimension to Moses' response. By listening to Jethro, Moses demonstrated confidence that God's truth is not limited by ethnicity or national identity. Jethro was a Midianite priest, not an Israelite elder. Yet Moses did not reject his insight simply because it came from outside Israel. Instead, he evaluated the counsel according to its wisdom and its harmony with God's purposes. This openness reflects remarkable discernment. The biblical narrative does not encourage uncritical acceptance of every outside influence, but neither does it encourage rejecting wisdom solely because of its source. Moses recognized that God could use the experience of a faithful and thoughtful outsider to strengthen his covenant people. That lesson would echo throughout biblical history, reminding readers that humility often creates opportunities for God to work in unexpected ways. Once the new leadership structure had been established, Jethro's purpose at Sinai was complete. He had rejoiced in God's deliverance, worshipped alongside Israel's leaders, identified a hidden weakness in the nation's administration, and offered counsel that Moses faithfully implemented. His visit had left a permanent mark upon Israel's development. Yet, one question remained unanswered. After witnessing these extraordinary events and contributing one of the most influential pieces of practical wisdom in the Old Testament, what became of Jethro himself? The biblical narrative now turns to that final stage of his story, where history, tradition, and scholarly interpretation intersect around the quiet departure of the Midianite priest whose influence would long outlast his brief appearance in the pages of Scripture. After Moses implemented Jethro's advice and Israel's leadership structure was firmly established, the biblical narrative reaches an unexpectedly quiet conclusion to Jethro's visit. There is no dramatic farewell speech, no lengthy blessing, and no elaborate account of his departure. Instead, Exodus records the event in a single sentence. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own land. At first glance, the statement appears straightforward. Jethro came to Sinai, reunited with Moses and his family, worshipped the God of Israel, offered practical counsel that reshaped the nation's administration, and then returned home to Midian. Yet this brief conclusion has generated centuries of discussion, because later biblical passages introduce details that seem, at least initially, to complicate the picture. Understanding what happened requires carefully distinguishing between what Exodus explicitly states, what other biblical texts contribute, and where genuine uncertainty remains. The clearest fact is that Exodus itself presents Jethro's departure as the natural conclusion of his visit. The narrative neither criticizes nor questions his decision. There is no suggestion that returning to Midian reflected a lack of faith, or diminished the significance of his confession concerning the God of Israel. Instead, the account simply recognizes that Jethro had responsibilities beyond the Israelite camp. As the priest of Midian and the head of an established household, he remained responsible for a community that depended upon his leadership. His journey to Sinai had never been described as a permanent relocation. It had been undertaken because he heard what God had done for Israel, and because he wished to reunite Moses with Zipporah and their sons. Having accomplished those purposes, he departed peacefully. The simplicity of the narrative itself is instructive. The Bible often avoids answering questions that later generations naturally ask because its primary concern lies elsewhere. In this case, the focus remains upon Israel's preparation for receiving God's covenant at Sinai. Once Jethro's role in that preparation had been completed, the story returned to the covenant relationship between God and Israel. Nevertheless, another passage invites closer examination. In Numbers 10, as Israel prepares to leave Mount Sinai and continue its journey toward the Promised Land, Moses speaks to Hobab, identified in many English translations as the son of Reuel the Midianite. Moses' father-in-law, Moses urges him to accompany Israel, promising that he will share in the blessings the Lord intends for his people. Hobab initially declines, saying that he intends to return to his own land and relatives. Moses persists, explaining that Hobab's familiarity with the wilderness would make him invaluable as a guide, because he knows where to camp in the desert. The passage concludes without explicitly stating whether Hobab accepted Moses' invitation. This text has generated one of the most discussed questions surrounding Jethro's family. Is Hobab another name for Jethro himself? Or is Hobab Jethro's son, and therefore Moses' brother-in-law? Ancient naming practices allowed individuals to possess multiple names or titles, making either possibility historically conceivable. Some biblical passages appear to identify Hobab as Moses' father-in-law, while others connect that role with Reuel or Jethro. As a result, interpreters have proposed several solutions. One view argues that Jethro, Reuel, and Hobab all refer to the same individual, each representing a different name or title. Another suggests that Reuel was the family patriarch, Jethro was Moses' father-in-law, and Hobab was Moses' brother-in-law who later traveled with Israel. A third proposal reverses some of those relationships while attempting to harmonize every passage. Despite centuries of careful study, no single explanation has achieved universal agreement. What remains important is recognizing that these discussions concern questions of family identification, rather than contradictions concerning Jethro's character or role. The central message of Exodus 18 remains unaffected, regardless of which genealogical reconstruction one adopts. Additional insight comes from the book of Judges, where the descendants of the Kenite, associated with Hobab, appear living among the people of Judah. Judges 1:16 refers to the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, who settled in the Negev after traveling with the people of Judah. Later, Judges 4 introduces Heber the Kenite, whose wife Jael becomes famous for her role in Israel's victory over Sisera. These passages demonstrate that at least some members of Moses' extended Midianite family became closely connected with Israel after the wilderness period. Whether this occurred through Hobab, through other relatives, or through a broader integration of Kenite groups remains debated among scholars. But the biblical evidence clearly indicates an enduring relationship between Israel and portions of Moses' Midianite family. This distinction helps explain why Exodus can truthfully describe Jethro returning to his own land, while later books still describe members of his family living alongside Israel. Jethro's personal departure does not exclude the possibility that other relatives eventually accompanied the Israelites or settled among them. Another question frequently raised concerns Jethro's spiritual future. After declaring that the Lord is greater than all gods and participating in worship before God, did he continue worshiping the God of Israel after returning to Midian? Once again, the biblical text remains silent. Scripture neither records his later life nor describes his final years. This silence has encouraged a rich variety of interpretations within Jewish, Christian, and even Islamic traditions. Rabbinic literature often portrays Jethro as a sincere convert who abandoned idolatry and devoted himself entirely to the worship of the God of Israel. Some traditions even credit him with influencing future generations through his faith. Christian commentators have frequently emphasized his confession as evidence that God's redemptive work extends beyond ethnic Israel, seeing him as an early example of a Gentile responding positively to divine revelation. Islamic tradition also honors Jethro, commonly identifying him with the prophet Shu'aib, although the Quran does not explicitly equate the two figures, and many scholars caution against treating them as unquestionably identical. These later traditions illustrate the lasting impression Jethro left across multiple faith communities. Yet they should be distinguished carefully from the more restrained testimony of the biblical text itself. Exodus simply leaves his later life unrecorded. That literary restraint serves an important purpose. The Bible does not attempt to satisfy every historical curiosity. Instead, it highlights the moments most essential to God's unfolding plan of redemption. Jethro appears precisely when his presence advances that story, then quietly exits once his role has been fulfilled. His importance, therefore, does not depend upon the number of chapters devoted to him, but upon the significance of the contributions he makes while he is present. He welcomed Moses during exile, helped shape the years that prepared Israel's future leader, publicly acknowledged God's greatness after the Exodus, participated in worship before the Lord, and provided administrative wisdom that strengthened the nation before the covenant at Sinai. Those contributions remain firmly established regardless of what details about his later years remain unknown. In many ways, Jethro's departure reflects the humility that consistently characterized his entire life. He never sought permanent prominence within Israel. He did not attempt to become one of its central leaders, nor did he remain simply because history's spotlight had briefly turned toward him. Having completed the purpose for which he entered the narrative, he returned quietly to the responsibilities awaiting him in Midian. The biblical account allows him to leave with dignity, without diminishing either his faith or his influence. Yet although Jethro himself disappears from the pages of Exodus, his story does not end there. His name, his family, and his example continue to echo throughout later biblical history and beyond, shaping Jewish interpretation, Christian reflection, and scholarly discussion for centuries. To understand the full measure of his legacy, it is necessary to explore how subsequent generations remembered the Midianite priest who forever changed the leadership of Israel, while remaining one of the Bible's most intriguing figures from outside the covenant nation. By the time the biblical narrative concludes Jethro's story, readers know surprisingly little about the remainder of his life. He enters the book of Exodus at decisive moments, influences the development of Israel in profound ways, and then quietly returns to his own land. Yet, his brief appearance proved so memorable that later generations continued reflecting upon his life long after the events of the Exodus had passed. Jewish rabbis, Christian theologians, historians, and biblical scholars have all returned repeatedly to the figure of Jethro, asking what his story reveals about wisdom, leadership, faith, and the relationship between Israel and the surrounding nations. These later interpretations should not be confused with the biblical text itself. Rather, they represent thoughtful attempts by successive generations to understand the significance of a man whose influence far exceeded the number of verses devoted to him. One of the earliest and most influential streams of interpretation emerged within Jewish tradition. The rabbis were fascinated by Jethro because he seemed to occupy a unique place in Israel's history. He was neither an Israelite nor an enemy of Israel. Instead, he stood as a respected outsider who recognized the greatness of the God of Israel and whose practical wisdom strengthened the covenant community at a critical moment. Rabbinic literature therefore expands upon details that Scripture leaves unexplained, not to replace the biblical narrative but to explore its implications. Some traditions portray Jethro as a man who had studied every form of worship known in the ancient world before concluding that the God of Israel alone deserved complete devotion. This image emphasizes his confession in Exodus 18, presenting it as the culmination of a lifelong search for truth. Other rabbinic writings describe him as abandoning idolatry despite opposition from his own people, highlighting courage rather than convenience as the defining feature of his faith. While these stories go beyond the information preserved in Scripture, they reveal how deeply Jewish interpreters admired Jethro's willingness to recognize God's work, even though he came from outside Israel. Another recurring theme in Jewish interpretation concerns Jethro's wisdom. The rabbis frequently viewed his advice to Moses as evidence that practical insight is itself a gift from God. His proposal to appoint capable judges throughout Israel became an enduring example of leadership rooted in humility rather than personal ambition. Some rabbinic commentators even observed that Moses' willingness to accept counsel from his father-in-law demonstrated spiritual maturity equal to his willingness to receive instruction directly from God. In their understanding, true greatness included the ability to recognize wisdom regardless of its source, provided that it remained consistent with God's purposes. This perspective reinforced an important principle within Jewish thought. Reverence for divine revelation did not eliminate the value of careful observation, accumulated experience, or thoughtful judgment. Instead, these forms of wisdom could work together in faithful service to God. Christian interpretation likewise found enduring significance in Jethro's story, though often emphasizing different aspects of his character. Early Christian writers frequently viewed him as an example of a Gentile responding positively to God's revelation before the worldwide mission described in the New Testament, long before the Apostle Paul carried the gospel throughout the Roman Empire. Jethro stood as a reminder that people outside Israel could recognize the greatness of the true God and rejoice in his saving work. Church fathers such as Origen and Augustine reflected upon Jethro as evidence that God's redemptive purposes were never intended to remain confined within ethnic boundaries alone. They did not argue that Jethro became part of Israel in the covenantal sense established at Sinai, but they saw in his confession an anticipation of the later inclusion of people from every nation through God's unfolding plan of salvation. Medieval Christian commentators continued this line of thought while also focusing upon Jethro's relationship with Moses. They observed that one of the greatest leaders in biblical history willingly received correction from a foreign priest, interpreting the episode as a powerful lesson in humility. For these writers, Moses' greatness consisted not only in his miracles, but also in his teachable spirit. Jethro therefore became an example of the truth that God may use unexpected individuals to provide guidance for his servants. This interpretation resonated strongly within Christian monastic communities, where humility and openness to wise counsel were considered essential virtues for spiritual growth. During the Reformation, Scholars such as John Calvin drew attention to the practical dimensions of Jethro's advice. Calvin argued that although the specific governmental structure established in Exodus 18 belonged to Israel's historical circumstances, the underlying principles of shared responsibility, trustworthy leadership, and wise delegation possessed enduring value, rather than treating Jethro's proposal as a rigid political blueprint for every society. Reformers generally emphasized the universal wisdom reflected in its concern for justice, accountability, and the well-being of both leaders and those they served. Modern biblical scholarship approaches Jethro from additional perspectives while continuing to distinguish between the scriptural account and later interpretive traditions. Historians examine what his title as priest of Midian reveals about tribal leadership in the late Bronze Age and the social structures of pastoral communities in northwestern Arabia and the Sinai region. Archaeologists explore the broader cultural setting in which Midianite societies lived, traded, and interacted with neighboring peoples. Recognizing that direct archaeological evidence concerning Jethro himself remains unavailable, literary scholars study how the biblical author intentionally positions Jethro within the Exodus narrative, noting that his arrival immediately before the giving of the law creates a transition from God's mighty acts of deliverance to the establishment of Israel's covenant community. Others analyze the dialogue between Moses and Jethro as one of Scripture's finest examples of wisdom literature, embedded within historical narrative, where careful observation and practical discernment complement divine revelation without competing against it. Among the most widely discussed academic questions remains the so-called Midianite or Canaanite hypothesis, which proposes that traditions concerning the worship of Yahweh may have circulated among southern peoples before Israel's arrival at Sinai. This theory draws upon passages connecting God's appearance with regions such as Seir, Paran, and Midian, together with the close relationship between Moses and Jethro. Some scholars suggest these traditions preserve memories of early Yahweh worship among groups outside Israel, while many others argue that the evidence remains inconclusive and does not justify such far-reaching conclusions. Importantly, the book of Exodus itself never states that Moses learned the identity of Yahweh from Jethro, or that Midian served as the original source of Israel's faith. Instead, Scripture consistently presents God's self-revelation at the burning bush as the decisive moment in Moses' understanding of his divine commission. Recognizing the distinction between scholarly hypotheses and explicit biblical claims remains essential for responsible interpretation. Despite their differences, Jewish tradition, Christian theology, and modern biblical scholarship share one striking observation. All recognize that Jethro's importance cannot be measured by the number of verses devoted to him. He appears only briefly, yet his influence extends into theology, ethics, leadership, and biblical interpretation across more than 3,000 years of religious reflection. His story challenges simplistic assumptions about who may recognize God's work, who may offer wise counsel, and how humility enables faithful leadership. Even where interpreters disagree about particular historical details, they consistently acknowledge the extraordinary impact of the Midianite priest upon the development of Israel's national life. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Jethro's legacy is the restraint with which Scripture presents him. The Bible never attempts to transform him into a heroic figure overshadowing Moses, nor does it romanticize his background or speculate about every stage of his life. Instead, it records his actions with deliberate simplicity and allows readers to appreciate his significance through what he actually says and does. That literary restraint has given later generations room to reflect upon his example without losing sight of the biblical narrative's central focus on God's faithfulness. Jethro remains memorable, not because he sought prominence, but because he consistently pointed beyond himself. First, by rejoicing in God's deliverance, then by strengthening God's servant, and finally by departing quietly once his task had been completed. As the story of Jethro approaches its conclusion, one final question remains. Beyond the historical discussions, theological reflections, and centuries of interpretation, what lasting lessons does his life leave for readers today? His legacy extends far beyond ancient Midian or the wilderness of Sinai, offering enduring insights into faith, leadership, humility, and the surprising ways God chooses to accomplish his purposes through people who often stand just outside the center of history while quietly helping to shape it. Jethro never confronted Pharaoh. He never stretched out a staff over the Red Sea. He never received the 10 Commandments, led Israel through the wilderness, or entered the pages of Scripture as one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. In terms of recorded appearances, he occupies only a small portion of the biblical narrative, yet measured by influence rather than prominence. Jethro stands among the most remarkable supporting figures in the story of Moses. His legacy reminds readers that history is often shaped not only by those who stand at the center of great events, but also by those whose wisdom quietly enables others to fulfill the work God has entrusted to them. The Bible introduces him as a Midianite priest, a tribal leader living outside the covenant nation of Israel. Yet it never portrays him as an enemy or rival. Instead, he becomes one of the clearest examples in the Old Testament of an individual from another nation who recognizes the greatness of the God of Israel and responds with humility, gratitude, and thoughtful action. That alone makes his story extraordinary. At a time when national identities and religious loyalties often defined relationships between neighboring peoples, Jethro demonstrates that reverence for God and genuine wisdom are not confined to political boundaries. His presence within the Exodus narrative quietly foreshadows a theme that will continue developing throughout the rest of Scripture, namely, that God's work in history is witnessed not only by Israel, but also by the nations surrounding her. Jethro's first enduring contribution lies in the role he played during the hidden years of Moses' life. Without Midian, there would have been no 40-year period of preparation between Moses' failed attempt to defend the Hebrews and his return to Egypt as God's chosen deliverer. Without Jethro's hospitality, Moses would have remained a homeless fugitive in an unfamiliar land. Without the stability of Jethro's household, the former prince of Egypt would never have experienced the quiet discipline of ordinary work that transformed his character. The biblical narrative does not suggest that Jethro understood the full significance of what was unfolding. He welcomed a weary refugee because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected that refugee to become one of history's greatest leaders. Yet, that simple act of generosity became part of God's larger providential plan. It is one of Scripture's recurring patterns that ordinary acts of faithfulness often carry consequences far beyond what anyone involved can foresee. Jethro's second lasting contribution appears in the realm of leadership. His advice to Moses remains one of the earliest and clearest examples of healthy delegation preserved in ancient literature, rather than encouraging endless self-sacrifice that ultimately weakens both leader and community. Jethro recognized that sustainable leadership requires shared responsibility. His counsel affirmed Moses' unique calling, while preventing that calling from being buried beneath responsibilities others could faithfully carry. Centuries have passed since that conversation at Sinai, yet the principle continues to resonate wherever families, communities, organizations, governments, churches, and institutions seek to balance authority with wise distribution of responsibility. Although leadership models vary across cultures and historical periods, the underlying insight remains remarkably consistent. Human beings possess real limits, and acknowledging those limits is not a sign of weakness, but an expression of wisdom. Jethro understood this long before modern discussions of organizational leadership, burnout, or institutional effectiveness ever existed. Just as significant was the manner in which that advice was received. Moses' willingness to listen transformed Jethro's counsel into lasting biblical instruction. Had Moses rejected the proposal out of pride, the conversation would have become little more than an interesting exchange between two respected men. Instead, because Moses responded with humility, the advice reshaped the administration of an entire nation. Their relationship, therefore, offers a rare example of leadership, strengthened by mutual respect rather than threatened by honest conversation. Jethro possessed the courage to speak difficult truth with compassion. Moses possessed the humility to recognize wisdom without viewing it as a challenge to his authority. Together, they demonstrate that genuine leadership flourishes where humility and truth meet, rather than where pride demands constant self-sufficiency. Another enduring aspect of Jethro's legacy lies in the balance he consistently maintained between faith and practical wisdom. Throughout the Exodus account, he never attempted to compete with God's revelation. He rejoiced when he heard what God had done. He publicly confessed the greatness of the Lord. He joined Moses, Aaron, and Israel's elders in worship before God. Only after acknowledging God's sovereign work did he address the practical realities of governing the nation. This sequence matters because it illustrates an important biblical principle. Practical wisdom reaches its fullest expression when grounded in reverence for God. Jethro did not separate spiritual devotion from responsible leadership. Instead, his actions demonstrate that the two belong together. Worship shaped his perspective, and that perspective informed the advice he offered. Modern readers sometimes imagine that Scripture values miraculous intervention while overlooking ordinary wisdom. Yet Jethro's story reveals the opposite. The God who parted the Red Sea also used the thoughtful observations of an experienced tribal elder to strengthen his people. Divine purpose and practical wisdom worked together rather than standing in opposition. Jethro also leaves behind an important lesson concerning humility in success. He entered Israel's camp after the greatest national deliverance recorded in the Old Testament, witnessed miracles that had altered the political landscape of the ancient Near East, and offered counsel that permanently influenced Israel's leadership. Yet, once his task had been completed, he quietly returned to his own land. He sought no permanent position within Israel's government, no public recognition, and no lasting personal influence over Moses' decisions. His story resists the temptation toward self-promotion that so often accompanies moments of historical significance. Instead, Jethro appears content to fulfill the role entrusted to him, and then step aside. That quiet departure may be one of the most revealing aspects of his character. He understood that faithfulness does not require remaining at the center of every story. Sometimes the greatest service is offered by those willing to contribute meaningfully without demanding continued attention afterward. From a broader biblical perspective, Jethro reminds readers that God frequently works through relationships that appear unlikely at first glance. An elderly Midianite priest and a Hebrew fugitive raised in Pharaoh's palace could hardly have represented more different backgrounds. Yet, their lives became inseparably connected through God's providence. One offered refuge when the other had nowhere to go. Years later, the former refugee returned as the leader of a redeemed nation, while the older priest offered wisdom that strengthened Israel for the journey ahead. Neither man could have anticipated those outcomes when they first met beside a well in Midian. Their story, therefore, encourages readers to recognize that God's providence often unfolds gradually through ordinary encounters whose full significance becomes visible only in retrospect. Perhaps this explains why Jethro continues to fascinate readers after thousands of years. He represents a kind of greatness rarely celebrated in human history. He achieved no military victories, established no dynasty, wrote no biblical book, and performed no recorded miracles. His influence rested instead upon hospitality offered to a stranger, wisdom shared without arrogance, reverence expressed without hesitation, and humility displayed without seeking recognition. These qualities possess a timeless relevance precisely because they remain accessible to ordinary people in every generation. Not everyone is called to become another Moses, but everyone can learn from Jethro's willingness to welcome, to listen, to rejoice in God's work, to speak truth with wisdom, and to depart without demanding applause. In the end, the story of Jethro is not simply the story of Moses' father-in-law. It is the story of how God used a faithful man from outside Israel to prepare, encourage, and strengthen the leader through whom he would accomplish one of the greatest acts of redemption recorded in the Old Testament. His life demonstrates that significance in God's purposes is never measured merely by the number of chapters devoted to a person, or by the prominence of a public role. It is measured by faithfulness to the responsibilities God places before us, however ordinary they may appear at the time. Long after Jethro disappeared from the pages of Exodus, the wisdom he offered, the humility he embodied, and the testimony he gave concerning the greatness of the Lord continued to echo throughout Scripture and across centuries of Jewish, Christian, and scholarly reflection. Though his journey ends quietly, his legacy endures as a powerful reminder that some of the most influential figures in biblical history are those who never sought the spotlight, yet faithfully illuminated the path for others to fulfill the calling God had placed upon their lives.